All right, stuff I like. We need stupid sounds for stuff I like. There's always this thing comes up, but it has no. This week I think it was this week I talked about the painting Hylas and the Nymphs by John William Waterhouse. It was taken down by the Manchester Museum, and I started talking kind of off the top of my head about the pre-Raphaelites, whom I love, and they were a group in the 19th century, in the Victorian era, who believed that everything after Raphael lost the richness of the medieval and the Gothic. It was kind of the Victorian era's sentimental version of the Romantics. They were trying to recapture what was being lost in the scientific revolution, which was the importance of the inner life of man, the legitimacy and the centrality of the inner life of man. And one of my favorites of the pre-Raphaelites was Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And you may know his name because his sister, Christina Rossetti, wrote the poem. She was a wonderful poet, and she wrote the poem that became the Christmas Carol in the Bleak Midwinter. And if you ever listen to the lyrics of that, you think like, oh, wow, those are really of another quality. That was Christina. He was also, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, he was very connected. He was homeschooled, and he was very connected to Romantic writings. So he loved Edgar Allan Poe. He loved Lord Byron. And he was one of the guys who restored William Blake, his posthumous reputation. William Blake died without ever having sold, I think, that can't be right. He was completely obscure when he died, one of the great English Romantic poets, a very strange guy, a visionary poet. Everybody thought he was crazy, but Dante Gabriel Rossetti collected his works and kind of restored his reputation posthumously. He began to help build his reputation. Now, in 1850, this is the part I want to get to, though. In 1850, Rossetti met a woman named Elizabeth Siddal, and she became not only his model, she ultimately became his wife, and she really became one of the models of all the pre-Raphaelites. Just put up one of the pictures. I sent in some of them. This is her as Proserpina, Proserpine, whatever they called her. Proserpina was the daughter of Ceres. She was kidnapped by the king of Hades and brought underground. And Ceres went in search of her, but when she finally recovered her, she'd already eaten. Pluto had given her 6 seeds of a pomegranate to eat. So every 6 months she had to go back underground, and every 6 months she came back to the top. And Ceres, who was the goddess of grain, that's how we got the seasons, essentially, because while she was gone, she mourned, so there was no grain, there was no growth, it was winter. And when her daughter would come back to her, it would be summer. And so if you can see it, this is Elizabeth Siddal with this incredibly beautiful red hair. Give me another one of the pictures that we put up. Here she is as Beatrix, who was the muse of Dante, who helped guide him to heaven in the Divine Comedy. So that's, of course, very meaningful because Dante Gabriel Rossetti shared the name with Dante, and so Elizabeth Siddal was his muse. But the most famous painting of Elizabeth Siddal was not done by Rossetti. It was done by Millais, John Millais, who painted this. This is the famous picture of Ophelia, the drowned Ophelia, which in Hamlet, Queen Gertrude comes in and gives this description of how she gathered all these flowers and then lay there, and her dress slowly, she was mad, and her dress slowly filled with water, and then the water carried her down and she was drowned. And that, again, is the beautiful Elizabeth Siddal. Now, these guys were just like most male artists. They were terrible people. They were constantly on drugs. They were constantly cheating on their women, and Rossetti was no different. This is my favorite story about, you'll see it's kind of a grim story. It's my favorite story about Rossetti and Elizabeth Siddal. He really just treated her badly. He cheated on her, and he would offer to marry her, and then at the last minute he would pull out. And she answered this by continually getting sick. And when he finally did marry her, they had to carry her to the wedding because she was so sick and wan and had lost so much weight. But because she was constantly sick, she started taking laudanum. Laudanum was opium. It was just like today that you get addicted to opiates. She got addicted to opiates, and she finally died of an overdose in 1862. Now, Rossetti was absolutely shattered. So when he buried her, he buried a journal with her that contained many of his poems, because he was also a poet. And he was not as good a poet as he was an artist, but his poetry became fairly famous. She was buried in Highgate Cemetery, which, if you've ever been to it, is one of these wonderful Victorian cemeteries. It looks like it's a living ghost story, okay? But after a while, he couldn't stand the fact that he had buried his poetry, and some of his friends were creating poetry, and they were becoming famous poets. And he wanted to publish some new poems, but he didn't have the old poems to publish with him. So he got permission to disinter the body so he could recover the poetry. And he was so ashamed of this that though he got legal permission to it, he went out in the dead. Oh, he didn't go himself. He sent his men out in the dead of night with torches, and they dug up Elizabeth Siddal. And because of the laudanum, she was very well preserved. So she looked, and they said that her hair had grown. Now that actually doesn't happen. Your hair doesn't grow after you die. But what happens is you shrink, you start to shrink. So she had that lush, beautiful red hair. And apparently they dug her up in the torches and all this stuff, and they got back the poetry and they published the poetry, which was attacked. It didn't do very well, but they brought out the poetry in the dead of night in this wonderful it's like a Victorian ghost story. Rossetti never got over this. He was haunted by this for the rest of his life. He was haunted by the guilt of having dug up Elizabeth Siddal, and probably by the way he treated her as well. But it's a wonderful, wonderful story. If you've never experienced the pre-Raphaelites, you probably have without knowing it. You probably have calendars with them on it. But take a look them up, because they just made such beautiful, beautiful Gothic, sentimental, but also wonderful paintings that took us back kind of into a medieval era with the new techniques that had come along since the Renaissance, and they really are beautiful. And Elizabeth Siddal was at the heart of many, many of their paintings. All right, enough of that. On to the Klavanless Weekend. I'm sorry, if you haven't listened to Another Kingdom, listen to Another Kingdom, and that will take you through the Klavanless Weekend. We will end, as always, with some music. I never watched the Super Bowl halftime show, but I am actually kind of a fan of Justin Timberlake. And the reason I'm a fan of Justin Timberlake is, if you remember him, it was NSYNC. He was one of these boy bands. They always had that kind of like yearning, thing where they were singing for 12-year-old girls and all this. But Justin Timberlake actually had talent, and he had a sense of humor about himself, and he's actually grown as an artist. So I went and listened to the signature, the title song of his new album, and it's actually, he's just good, and he says, it's called Man of the Woods, and he says the whole album is really about his son, who is named Silas, which apparently means Man of the Woods. Anyway, we'll end with that. I am Andrew Klavan. This is The Andrew Klavan Show. The Klavanless Weekend begins. Survivors, gather here on Monday, and I'll see you then. The Andrew Klavan Show is produced by Robert Sterling. Executive producer, Jeremy Boring. Senior producer, Jonathan Hay. Our supervising producer is Mathis Glover. Technical producer, Austin Stevens. Edited by Alex Zingaro. Audio is mixed by Mike Cormina. Hair and makeup is by Jesua Alvera. And our animations are by Cynthia Angulo and Jacob Jackson. The Andrew Klavan Show is a Daily Wire Forward Publishing production. Copyright Forward Publishing 2018.